The first time I heard the phrase unauthorized water feature, I nearly choked on my coffee. Apparently, that's what Elaine Zimmerman from the HOA called my pond. My pond. The one I dug by hand 10 years ago with my son when he was still young enough to think frogs were magical and mud was a good time. Now I was getting fined for it. Elaine, the HOA president, showed up at my front porch like a judge with a clipboard. Landon Vexler, your pond is a safety hazard. It attracts mosquitoes, violates aesthetic standards, and poses liability issues. I stared at her like she'd just accused me of harboring a swamp monster. It's a pond, not a biohazard lab, she sniffed. It needs to be filled in within 30 days or you'll be fined $200 per day. Starting retroactively from last week. Retroactively, I asked, squinting. You can't fine someone for something they didn't know about. She flipped a page on her clipboard. Clause 12 of the Environmental Compliance Addendum. You signed it when you moved in. I had. But that clause was about trash burning and chemical runoff, not garden ponds. I knew she was bluffing. Elaine always bluffed, banking on no one reading the fine print. Most didn't. I did. I'm not filling anything in, I said and shut the door, but that wasn't the end of it. A week later, I got a second notice, then a third, then a letter saying my property would be liened if I didn't comply. I was half a step from calling a lawyer when I noticed something odd. The pond water level was dropping. Fast. I hadn't changed anything. No leaks. No drought lately. But every morning the water was lower. One night I stayed up with a flashlight and walked the perimeter. That's when I found a narrow black pipe snaking from the HOA's maintenance lot behind my fence, hidden under brush and debris, draining into my pond. I followed the pipe back behind the HOA's storage shed. That's when things got uglier. The pipe didn't stop at my pond. It continued, draining runoff from their landscaping station fertilizers, grass clippings, oil from their mower into a trench that ran straight into the woods. I grew up in these parts. I knew those woods. And I knew they led to a protected wetland less than a half-mile down. Lane wasn't just trying to get rid of my pond. She was using it as a buffer to cover up illegal drainage from the HOA's own facility. I took photos. Lots of them. Pipe connections, water samples, timestamps. I even recorded the sound of the water trickling through the pipe late at night. I wasn't just going to fight this. I was going to bury them with it, but I needed proof that it reached the wetlands. So the next morning, I grabbed my boots, my camera, and a thermos of strong coffee, and I followed the pipe's trail through the woods. It didn't take long to find it. A shallow ravine behind the HOA's property, trickling with cloudy runoff and reeking of fertilizer. It disappeared into a creek that fed the wetlands. I snapped more photos, then pulled out my phone and called someone I hadn't talked to in years, my cousin Graham, a field agent for the State Environmental Board. Landon, he said, haven't heard from you in a while. Yeah, well. The HOA's about to learn what happens when you mess with a guy who reads the fine print. Graham didn't need convincing. Once I explained what I'd found and how far the runoff stretched, he asked for my address and told me to keep everything as is. No repairs, no alterations. Let it sit. He showed up that Friday afternoon in a state-marked truck, wearing a jacket with the Department of Environmental Regulation patch on the shoulder. He brought another agent, a younger woman named Tasha, who carried a thick binder and a soil kit. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. Where's the drainage pipe now? Graham asked as he stepped out of the vehicle, squinting up at the clear sky. Still feeding into the pond, I said. Hasn't slowed down. Good, Tasha said, snapping on gloves. We'll start with water samples from your pond, then trace the runoff back to the origin. If it's contaminating public land, this won't be just an HOA issue, it'll trigger a state-level violation. I led them around the back, past the rustling hedges and down the slope to the pond. Graham crouched at the edge, dipped a vial into the cloudy water and frowned. That's not just fertilizer. I'm smelling hydrocarbons. Could be from machinery storage. Tasha noted the location, date, and time before sealing the sample. Then we pushed through the underbrush behind the HOA's maintenance shed, where the pipe had been partially buried with dry leaves and broken cinder blocks. Graham peeled some of it back with a stick, revealing a junction where 3 smaller pipes merged into the black one that fed my pond. This is deliberate, he muttered. They didn't just misroute stormwater, they built a hidden bypass. Tasha followed the lines with a camera, documenting every inch. This qualifies as a concealed drainage system, no permit number, no visible filtration, and no signage. That's a triple violation under Code 4.17. I didn't know what Code 4.17 was, but from the way she said it, it wasn't something you wanted pinned to your name. An hour later, they finished collecting samples and taking photographs. Graham clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Don't touch anything. We'll file an emergency compliance order with the regional office. If this system is connected to protected wetlands, the HOA is looking at more than fines. We're talking civil penalties, possibly criminal charges, depending on how long this has been going on." I didn't have to wait long to see the fallout begin. By Tuesday, a pair of state-marked SUVs pulled into the HOA's lot just after sunrise. I watched from my upstairs window as two officers in plainclothes approached the maintenance shed. Moments later, they unspooled bright orange tape and sealed the area. Elaine arrived about 20 minutes later, pulling up in her silver crossover and stepping out in a suit 2 sizes too sharp for yard work. She started arguing immediately, arms waving, voice rising, but the officers didn't flinch. One handed her a paper, the other pointed at the shed. She stopped talking, stared at the document, and then turned pale. Later that afternoon, I got a knock at the door. This time it wasn't Elaine. "Mr. Vexler?" asked a tall man in a dark blue work jacket. He pulled a badge from his pocket. "Detective Rory Calder. I'm working with the state's Environmental Crimes Unit. Do you have a few minutes?" I invited him in, set out 2 chairs on the porch, and let him ask his questions. He wasn't interested in opinions, only facts: where I first noticed the water loss, how I traced the pipe, what documentation I had. I showed him my photos, recordings, and the footage from a motion-activated trail cam I'd hidden near the drainage path. That last bit got his full attention. "You set up a trail cam?" "Yeah. Figured if someone came to tamper with it, I'd catch them in the act." He watched the clip I'd saved, time-stamped footage of a man in a maintenance vest adjusting the pipe's junction at night under flashlight. "That's Eric Tackins," Calder said, "HOA's groundskeeper. He's already on record denying any knowledge of the drainage line." "Not anymore," I said. He nodded slowly. "We'll need a copy of this. This footage changes things." By the end of the week, the investigation had widened. The HOA board was subpoenaed for internal meeting notes and maintenance records. Elaine stopped showing up in person. Her emails to residents became frantic, long-winded explanations peppered with words like misunderstanding and temporary compliance review. But the damage was already done. I heard from my neighbor, Janice, that the HOA board had held a secret vote a month prior to authorize discretionary drainage improvements. She'd been suspicious because they never clarified what that meant, and when she asked, Elaine told her it was just routine irrigation alignment. Turns out they'd used HOA dues to hire an unlicensed contractor, someone's cousin, according to the rumors, to install the illegal drainage system. No permits, no inspections, just backdoor deals and hush-hush handshakes. That same week, a notice went out from the city planning department. A formal audit of Green Hollow Estates HOA was now underway. That meant every budget line, every maintenance invoice, and every committee decision for the past 5 years would be reviewed. It also meant the residents were furious. The next community meeting was packed. Folding chairs overflowed onto the sidewalk. People came with questions, documents, and in one case, a slideshow. I stood near the back, listening as neighbor after neighbor demanded answers. Why is our money paying for illegal pipes? Who approved this without a vote? Is it true someone's getting kickbacks from these contracts? Elaine didn't show. Instead, the vice president, a guy named Brad who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tried to calm the crowd. "We're cooperating fully with the investigation," he said, voice shaking. "Let's not jump to conclusions." "That didn't go over well," someone shouted. "Then explain why there's a lien on my house over a fake landscaping fine." Another resident held up a folder. I pulled the county zoning maps. "That maintenance lot was never zoned for chemical storage. You've been lying to us." Brad stammered something about procedural oversights, but it was too late. The crowd was turning. Eventually, someone proposed a motion to dissolve the current board pending the outcome of the investigation. It passed unanimously. By the time I left the meeting, two things had become clear. The HOA's power was crumbling and the community had finally woken up. People were exchanging numbers, forming committees, planning to audit the books themselves. For the first time in years, neighbors who barely nodded at each other were organizing. As I walked home under the dim glow of the streetlights, I passed the pond. The pipe had been capped temporarily by the state agents. The water was starting to clear. In the silence, frogs croaked lazily along the banks, unaware of the chaos their little habitat had helped uncover. And somewhere behind me, the last of the old guard was watching their kingdom slip through their fingers. By the end of the second week, the maintenance shed was padlocked and wrapped in red tape. Signs warned of pending environmental remediation and legal investigation. But it wasn't the shed that got everyone talking. It was the unmarked van that showed up on a Thursday afternoon and parked outside the HOA office. 3 men stepped out, serious expressions, leather satchels in hand. Not state agents this time. These were federal. EPA. I was in my garage fixing the mower belt when I spotted them. One of them had a laminated badge clipped to his lapel with a seal I didn't recognize at first. But then I saw the letters. DOJ, Environmental Crimes Section. They weren't here to ask questions. The next day, I got a visit from a woman in a navy pantsuit with a court-ordered subpoena in hand. Her name was Marin Delaney, Assistant U.S. Attorney. She asked if I could provide a sworn statement detailing the timeline of events leading up to the investigation and whether I'd be willing to testify if necessary. "I'm not afraid to," I said. "But what exactly are we dealing with?" She sat down on the porch bench and answered without hesitation. Based on the evidence already gathered, the HOA leadership conspired to divert chemical runoff into federally protected wetlands without permits, oversight, or disclosure. That's a felony under the Clean Water Act. We're pursuing charges not just against the board but also the contractor who installed the system and anyone who knowingly falsified HOA records to cover it. I stared at her. "You're saying prison time," she nodded. "If it holds in court, yes. Especially if we find proof of willful concealment or financial motive." That last part stuck with me. Financial motive. I'd always thought Elaine craved power, not profit, but maybe I'd underestimated just how deep the rot went. That evening, I walked over to Janice's house. She'd been organizing a neighborhood audit team since the board was suspended. Her dining room was piled with folders, receipts, and old newsletters dating back years. "Anything strange in the books?" I asked. She circled a figure in red ink and slid it across the table. "This right here. $18,000 billed to Landscape Consulting last spring. There's no corresponding contractor name, no receipt, no project description. We checked the grounds logs, nothing changed that month." I frowned. "That's around the time the pipe system would have been installed." "Exactly. And it gets worse." She flipped through another folder, pulling out a printed email thread. Someone on the board flagged the expense and asked for documentation. 2 days later, they resigned. No explanation. Who? Janice tapped the name. Cynthia Morales. She was the treasurer up until last May. I stared at the name. I hadn't seen Cynthia since the last community cookout, where she quietly handed off hot dogs and barely spoke to anyone. She'd always been reserved, but now her silence seemed less like awkwardness and more like fear. "I need to talk to her," I said. Janice hesitated. "She moved out 2 months ago, but I think I still have her contact info." It took a day to track her down. She answered the phone on the 3rd ring, cautious and quiet. I introduced myself and said I wasn't calling to pressure her, just to ask what had really happened. She didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, "They forged my signature on the reimbursement forms." That hit like a hammer. "I didn't know what it was for at first," she continued. "When I asked for the backup paperwork, Elaine told me it was an accounting mix-up. Then Brad warned me to let it go, said the board had alternative records that weren't for public review. I resigned that week." "Did you keep any of it?" I asked. "I was scared," she admitted. "But yes. I made copies. I still have them." An hour later, she forwarded me a scanned packet of documents. Among them, a reimbursement form for $18,000, signed in Cynthia's name but with a signature that didn't remotely match the ones on her previous forms. The vendor listed was simply Greenview Consulting. No address, no phone number, no tax ID. I sent it straight to Marin. That was the tipping point. 2 days later, federal agents returned with warrants. This time, they didn't just tape off the maintenance shed, they entered the HOA office and removed every file cabinet, every hard drive, every backup server. They questioned Elaine at her home, then seized her laptop and phone. The next morning, she was taken into custody. Residents gathered on their lawns as the news spread. A few whispered. Others openly cheered. No one defended her. Brad was next. He tried to claim ignorance, said he just signed what Elaine told him to. But the federal agents had phone logs, emails, even a recorded call in which he discussed reducing HOA exposure by deleting meeting notes. He was arrested that afternoon. At the next emergency assembly, held in the community park under a rented canopy, Marin addressed the residents directly. She explained the charges being filed: conspiracy, environmental violations, wire fraud, and falsifying financial records. The HOA as a legal entity would remain frozen until a court-appointed receiver could review the full extent of the misconduct. A hand shot up from the crowd. "What happens to the rest of us, our dues, our homes?" Marin answered calmly. "Victims of HOA financial fraud can petition for relief through civil court. If funds were misappropriated, restitution may be available." Another man asked, "And the pond, can it stay?" She glanced at me. "The drainage system is being dismantled. The pond can remain, assuming it poses no actual environmental hazard, which, from what we've seen, it doesn't." A ripple of applause followed. I didn't say anything, just stood quietly near the back, letting it wash over me. Over the next week, the cleanup began. State contractors arrived to dismantle the illegal pipeline, haul off contaminated soil, and reseed the damaged ravine behind the HOA lot. The trail that had once funneled fertilizer and oil into the wetlands was sealed with clay and anchored with native grasses. The new interim board, made up entirely of volunteers from the neighborhood, began the slow process of untangling years of mismanagement. Janice was named acting treasurer. She asked me to serve on the compliance committee, but I declined. I'd had my fill of HOA politics. Instead, I helped replant the banks of the pond with my son, who was home on break from college. We added cattails, lilies, and a small wooden sign that read, "Community Wildlife Refuge Protected by the People." One afternoon, a boy from down the street wandered by with a net and a plastic bucket. He asked if he could try catching frogs. I told him to go for it and watched him chase shadows across the muddy edge. Laughing, by the end of the summer, the neighborhood looked different. Not just in the obvious ways: the locked shed, the new board, the absence of Elaine's clipped emails, but in the way people greeted each other. They waved more, talked longer, trusted deeper. The pond that once drew fines had become a symbol, not of rebellion but of resilience, of what happens when you dig deep, stand your ground, and refuse to let power hide behind paper. And somewhere in a courthouse downtown, a judge signed off on the charges that would make sure Elaine and her cronies never served on any board again. The first hearing was scheduled for early October. Not the criminal trial that would take months, but a civil petition from the residents of Green Hollow Estates to formally dissolve the HOA and appoint a permanent receiver. It was unprecedented in our county, but considering what had unfolded, no one was surprised it had come to this. I was called to testify, not just as the whistleblower, but as the homeowner whose property had been used without consent as a shield for a crime that reached far beyond rotten leadership. I wore the only suit I owned, pressed the night before, and carried a binder of evidence that had grown thicker than I ever expected. My name was called after a short recess. Judge Marlowe, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and a demeanor like brushed steel, adjusted her glasses as I approached the stand. "Mr. Vexler," she said, "you were the original complainant regarding the drainage issue, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Please describe briefly and factually what led to your discovery." I recounted the water level dropping, the pipe I'd found in the brush, the photos, the recordings, the trail that led to the protected wetlands. I explained how the pipe had been hidden, how it had bypassed any legal permits, and how the water in my own pond had been used as an unmonitored filtration point. She listened without interrupting, tapping her pen against the legal pad in front of her. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and asked, "Were you ever notified by the HOA of any work being done that might affect your property?" "No," I said. "Quite the opposite. I was fined for the pond being a hazard. They used their own violation notice to try to pressure me into removing it." There were murmurs in the courtroom, reporters, residents, and unfamiliar faces from other neighborhoods who had come to watch. Judge Marlowe tapped her gavel once. "Thank you, Mr. Vexler. You may step down." As I returned to my seat, I passed Elaine. She sat with her attorney, her posture stiff, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Her once impenetrable confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow stillness. She didn't look at me. She hadn't since the investigation began. The judge turned to the stack of documents submitted by the interim board and the state's Environmental Compliance Office. "We have before us evidence of falsified financial records, unauthorized construction, and a coordinated attempt to conceal hazardous drainage into federally protected land. In addition to civil fraud, this case has triggered multiple criminal investigations, which remain ongoing. But today, we are here to determine whether the HOA as a governing body is fit to continue operating." She paused, glancing across the courtroom. "I find that it is not." The gavel fell again, this time with finality. Outside the courthouse, the air was brisk. Autumn had arrived during the chaos, and the trees lining the county square were beginning to turn gold and rust. A local reporter approached, notebook in hand, but I shook my head. I wasn't interested in headlines. I just wanted to go home. Back in Green Hollow, the fallout continued. The state-appointed receiver began auctioning off the HOA's assets to pay restitution to residents who'd been falsely fined. The maintenance lot was cleared and sold to a park trust, which planned to convert it into a trailhead and picnic area. The lot behind my fence once used to hide the illegal drainage was reseeded and marked for conservation, sealed off from future development. A week later, I received a letter from the Department of Environmental Protection. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten, signed by the regional director herself. "Thank you for what you did. You preserved more than your own land. You helped protect a watershed that supplies clean water to 4 separate counties. Because of your actions, we've launched a broader audit of HOAs operating near protected zones. You set a precedent." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the back of my binder, behind the photos and court notices and environmental reports. It felt like the final page to a long chapter. But the real closure came on a quiet Saturday morning, 2 weeks later. I was outside, pulling weeds from the edge of the pond when a woman approached from the street. She was tall, wore work boots and a faded field jacket, and carried a clipboard under one arm. "Mr. Vexler?" she asked. "That's me." She extended a hand. "Rachel Mendez. I'm with the County Office of Natural Resources. We're launching a new community initiative. I was told this pond played a major role in uncovering the Green Hollow violations." I nodded, brushing dirt from my gloves. "It did." "Not exactly by choice." She smiled, not the polite kind, but one that came from genuine appreciation. "We're offering conservation status to select privately owned habitats, especially ones that support native species and runoff mitigation. If you're interested, we can designate this pond as a certified urban wetland. You'd retain full property rights, but the area would receive protection and ecological support from our department." I blinked. "You want to protect it, officially," she said. "We'll provide signage, a soil testing kit, and help you document species. It becomes part of the county's green map. It also qualifies for property tax relief." I didn't hesitate. "Yes, absolutely." She made notes on her clipboard. "We'll send someone out next week to take samples. In the meantime, if you see any unusual wildlife, keep a log. Frogs, turtles, birds, anything native." After she left, I walked the perimeter of the pond alone. The water had cleared, and I could see minnows darting between the reeds. A heron had started visiting in the mornings, standing motionless at the edge, perfectly still except for the occasional blink. The trail cam I'd once used to catch a crime now recorded snapshots of life. A fox nosing along the bank, a raccoon washing its paws, the heron mid-flight. Later that month, the interim board held a neighborhood gathering, not a meeting, just a celebration. They set up tables in the cul-de-sac, passed around cider and pumpkin bread, and handed out a printed flyer titled "Where We Go From Here." It laid out the plan. No new HOA. Just a voluntary civic association, transparent in its dealings, open to all. No dues, no fines, no secret meetings. Just neighbors helping neighbors keep things maintained and fair. I stood with Janice near the food table as kids ran past with painted faces and paper lanterns. "You think it'll hold?" I asked. She sipped her cider. "That depends. Are people done giving up their power just to avoid a little responsibility?" We watched as a group of teenagers helped an older couple carry folding chairs to their car. One of them, a boy in a football hoodie, pointed toward the pond and said something about building a birdhouse along the edge. I nodded. Looks like they might be. Later that night, I walked back to the pond. The new conservation sign hadn't arrived yet, but I didn't need it to tell me what I already knew. This place had become more than a pond. It had become proof that one person, with enough patience and a camera, could unravel something rotten that had festered for years. And that when people stop looking the other way and start asking the right questions, even the most stubborn systems of power can be dismantled. The frogs croaked a little louder that night, or maybe I just heard them more clearly. I stood for a while, watching the moon ripple across the water, knowing that, for the first time in a long while, everything was exactly where it belonged.